Welcome. This is the Something Ventured podcast. My guest today is Tim Rosenblatt. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm really excited to have you here. This is going to be great.
Yeah, man. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
This is so you're probably one of the most technical or thoughtful about technical stuff for Silicon Valley podcasts, believe it or not, that I've had on so far. You've been coding for something like 20 years on the web since 1996, coding on the web since 1996, when the web was probably made out of sticks or something like that. You were at CloudSpace, which is an engineering agency that touches a lot of projects and a lot of projects that touch a lot of people, as I understand it. You're relatively recently arrived in the Bay Area, in California terms, 3 or 4 years ago, so you spend a lot of time thinking about people and technology, and we'll talk a bit about that, but you have a perspective of what it's like to not necessarily be in the hotbed of Silicon Valley, which I think is something fairly interesting to talk about. And on top of all that, you are writing a book.
I am writing a book.
That's great. We'll talk about that a bit too.
That's
so
exciting.
It's an interesting day here in Silicon Valley, and part of this podcast is that people all over the world presumably can listen in. That's what podcasts allow. That radio,
and with the syndication, the listenership has just skyrocketed.
To hundreds, if not thousands of people. It is like hundreds of people though, and I didn't really intend for people to listen. I don't know what I intended. But then,
I like that you just kind of dove into this, like, I'm just going to try this out. But you said one of the other podcasts got a couple, over 1,000. You cracked the 1,000 mark.
Yeah, it's something like that. And
That's
exciting.
exciting.
It's hard to podcasting's weird. It's hard to tell how many people are listening because there's downloads, but then downloads happen automatically. And whether it's a whole topic that Apple doesn't really let you. Apple could and doesn't tell you how many people listen to your podcast.
Yeah,
and I think they cite some kind of a privacy thing, but I can't I don't need to know who listened to my podcast. There's a whole thesis about that. But in any case, what happened in Robin Williams just passed away, the comedic actor.
Yeah, yesterday. Yeah.
And I say it surprises me. Like I wouldn't have thought this a week ago, but it really kind of hit. He lived in the Bay Area. He lived up in Marin, which is just north of the Golden Gate Bridge. Seacliff before that, really kind of hit everyone in the Bay Area hard. Like it's a thing. Like I was listening to sports radio this morning, and they were talking about the Giants baseball team. They were talking about Robin Williams and their experiences running into him. It was kind of
I was at the gym this morning on ESPN on TV. They were running just B-roll of all the times Robin Williams has been at games.
Yeah,
and it seems like California's a big state, right? The whole plan, the plan to split California up into smaller places.
Yeah, right.
Southern California, right? They have they have all of the celebrities.
Yeah.
I feel like up here, it's not being from here, as you mentioned, and we'll talk about more, but, not being from here, it does seem like he had a certain, a certain link to being like the Northern California celebrity, and his personality and the way he worked seemed like it fit very well here.
Yeah.
You can be a little bit strange and a little eccentric in Northern California, and that is encouraged and accepted.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's interesting, just all the stories about him. Yeah, the last podcast I did, I think it just came out today, although I shouldn't talk dates in podcasts because things happen in the future
that
or in the past.
Yeah. This is basically time travel.
Exactly.
I'm Marty McFly.
Yeah, exactly. But the last podcast we talked about the Grateful Dead and their relationship to the Bay Area, and Steve Jobs was a Grateful Dead fan, and I don't know. We have a few quirks up here, but all the Robin Williams stories you hear are kind of about him. Like there's all these nice stories. Like I was walking around with my kids, and he came up and talked to the dogs and started doing a character for my kid. Like they're all these nice stories. They're not like, he told me to fuck off or whatever. And it's just interesting that it seemed to strike us a little bit here too.
Yeah, it's actually I was saying to you earlier, my girlfriend felt she grew up out here.
Yeah.
A lot of, I think, sort of Robin Williams knew people she knew, so she that sort of circle, and she wanted to do something nice, so we dropped flowers off at the Seacliff house yesterday. And,
oh wow!
News trucks were rolling in while we were there. Yeah, actually,
there were a lot of people there dropping off flowers, or what was it?
There, it was pretty early in the evening. I think it went on for a while. But there was a news truck. Like it was the worst parking job I've ever seen in my life. But they were just beep 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 right outside his house, and it was it sort of gave that perspective of like, oh yeah, this is not a local, it's a local issue, but also like this is going to be getting a lot, of attention because, he's had such an insanely long and productive career. I mean, I'm sitting here, I'm going to be 32 next month.
Yeah.
Had to do that math.
Yeah.
And, I grew up in, Robin Williams' pop culture, right?
Yeah.
I was in that sweet spot that Aladdin was a movie that I saw as a kid. And, he, stole that whole show.
Yes, it's so funny you say you grew up in his thing, and like I did too, like Mork and Mindy.
Yeah.
And then there was...
Exactly.
Yeah, and you start, like, you watch some of those, the kind of retrospectives, you're like, holy crap, he did all, like, that was a lot of stuff he did.
He was, he was a hustler.
Yeah.
He worked, and I say that in the work ethic sense of the word, that he worked. He obviously, had a lot of energy and put that very much into his art.
Yeah.
Which, I have a lot of respect for, especially being, out here in the tech scene where that dynamic happens a lot. I have a lot of respect for people who are able to productively, in the way that he did in terms of like producing quality work, put that energy in all the time.
Yeah.
That's
it's incredible. It's a sad tale too. He was struggling with depression and it's apparently a suicide. So full disclosure, so I don't go to podcast court, work at a company called Nuzzle. We're going to have the CEO, Jonathan Abrams, founder and CEO, is going to come on the podcast finally, and he'll be great. And he is great. And the product he's created, Nuzzle, is a social news app, and one of the things it lets you do is see the news that's being shared by a group of people. And one group of people that we track is comedians and people who write about comedy. And the top story that they're sharing today, the top one is about a particular person's, I forget who, a particular person's retrospective about Robin Williams. But then about 5 or 6 of the other stories that comedians are sharing are about depression.
Yeah.
Like how depression gets you and addiction and that kind of thing, which is kind of an interesting...
I've had the same... I've told you how much I love Nuzzle. I mean, I use it, 2, 3, 4 times every single day, at least. And I have seen a lot of links go around there, and I think that is, in a way, it's, whatever decisions he chose to make. He did choose to make them, but I think there's a lot more support for acceptance of those sort of things and helping people talk about it and realize, like, there's a lot of ways of getting the support and getting the help that you need. So I like seeing those stories roll out that support and acceptance and that sort of thing.
And it's interesting, the depression stories seem to have come out in particular with a particular energy and tempo in the comedian community, which is probably you're an actor, you're a performer, there's different pressures, there's different things that bring you into it. I'm not really competent to speak on it, but it was notable that a couple stories were about Robin Williams, retrospective, of course, and then a lot of them were about depression. So in any case, kind of a sad tale, but touching, and man, what a great, too short, but what a great life that guy had. In any case, it's my duty now to update everybody on sexism issues in Silicon Valley, and I'll tell you the story today, and then I don't mean to rabble rouse. I will bring it. It's important. I think it's important in the tech industry because there's relatively few women in the tech industry, so making sure that we appropriately address sexism, I think, is important. On the other hand, I understand you can get the tone wrong on that and go too far. But the one today was there was some company that they have a product. It's a phone, and they have a contest. And so to promote the phone, they've got a production problem. They don't have enough of these phones. It's an Android phone. This came up on the Nuzzle Android list, and so their idea was to have women like write the name of the phone somewhere on their body, take a picture, and then guys could vote on it. So somebody thinks this is a good idea, and post it. And of course, so few women do it. But what most women do is like take pictures of themselves, like giving them the finger, which is kind of funny. And now I'm tracking it. It's like 6 hours in. And so the tweet, which says something like, "Hey ladies, here's a way to get a phone," like they haven't deleted the tweet.
Oh no.
or apologized, which means either they don't know that you can delete tweets and apologize on Twitter, or they just think it's a pretty good idea and they're getting good press. But I thought that one was a particularly egregious one.
How many people did that decision go through to start?
I don't know. That's what I look at that and I'm like, okay, whoever the CEO of that company is, if I was an investor, I'd be like, I'm kind of worried about you being sexist. I'm really worried about your judgment. Like
that is
like, that's just incredibly poor judgment.
Yeah,
you're not 12. Worst case you're 23 or 25. God forbid you're 30 and you're doing that. But
if you're under 25 and it seems like a good idea, don't.
It's just leave it. Yeah, just I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, or at this point you've seen the Twitter reaction. Like you've seen all these women post pictures of themselves holding up signs saying this is sexist. Like screw you. Like what?
Yeah, that on the surface sounds, and I'm not sure which company you're talking about, so I hope I'm not offending any of my friends. If they are, they're idiots.
Yeah,
that seems like an insane thing, and that is that is the sort of thing that adds to that the tone of the debate. That there are some absolutely outlandish things that get done that get people understandably riled up.
Yeah.
And I think that, really makes it tough that when there are kind of those grayer issues, that there isn't, a healthy and open and sort of understanding debate about that. Because, fundamentally what we're talking about here is gray and fuzzy. We're talking about people's experiences.
Yeah.
The Yes All Women hashtag that you covered with Rachel.
Yeah.
It's this idea that all women have some type of experience like this.
Right.
But explaining experience is incredibly hard. If you go on a roller coaster and you get off and someone says, well, what's it like? I've never been on a roller coaster before. Right. You're like, oh, well, you're at a loss for words because it's like, well, go have that experience. And what we're fundamentally talking about when you look at sexism there's the whole gender spectrum, but to sort of reduce it to just men versus women, by definition, you're never going to have the ability to have that other experience. Although, actually to somewhat bring it back, Mrs. Doubtfire with Robin Williams, where they sort of touched on some of those issues a little bit, I think.
Yeah.
It's really hard to kind of have those, have a full appreciation for what that experience is like. Yeah. And so I think it requires a lot of very close attention and listening and deliberate attempts to understand the other person's perspective. Right. And I say this on both sides, frankly.
That's right. Yeah.
So these sort of stunts are really unfortunate because it creates that really hostile tone, and I don't see that. Helping.
Yeah, and I've gotten some criticism on the podcast of the concept that this is the easy stuff, right? Like gleefully making fun of people who do fairly dumb stuff. Like that's not really the problem.
But they should be mocked. They need to be mocked.
Yeah, they should be. And they should just quickly take down the tweet and apologize. And everyone's like, I don't know what you're referring to, because probably no one screen captured the tweet anyway. And you apologize, some staffer did. You can get past it, but to let it go,
to continue, to play devil's advocate and try and help them out a little bit. It's a passive thing at this point. They're not continuing to actively tweet. Oh, maybe I don't know this. Maybe they are continuing to actively tweet. Yeah. But there is a certain, at some point, I hope they take this tweet down, since you said it just happened.
Yeah.
But if you make a mistake, apologize. So many things in life will get easier if you just apologize when you do something wrong.
Yeah, it'd be fine. Like, I'm not gonna remember the company's name in 6 months, and maybe buy their product if it doesn't, become an internet meme. So anyway, that's
everyone makes mistakes. We're in Silicon Valley, right? We actually have FailCon. There's actually a convention where people come together and talk about the various ways in which they have committed egregious errors.
Yeah, I think I've made 7 mistakes so far today. I don't get out of bed without making.
You should get a punch card or something to keep track.
Yeah, exactly. But, frequent flyer miles.
You're going to make mistakes. I think the important thing in life is, and not that I'm particularly wise, but I am aiming in that direction, I hope. You're going to make mistakes. I think the important thing is how you handle them and how you respond to them.
No, I think that's right. And that's just my sexism update. So let's talk tech. You turned me on to a fantastic book. This book is called Tubes, and I forget the author. Do you know the author? I can append it in the podcast at the beginning. It's the book called Tubes.
Can we use some digital wizardry to Photoshop us saying the right thing in?
Well, I'll introduce the podcast and say, hey, when we refer to that book Tubes, it's by this fantastic author. And essentially what it is it's a guy. So the name is based on a senator who referred to the internet as a series of tubes and was kind of mocked for that. And so this guy, a good reporter, goes out and finds the internet, the physicality of the internet, the places where the computers are, the places in the ground where the cables go into the dirt, the places where the cable comes out of the ocean, which turns out to be in a lot of the old port cities like Lisbon. There's a cable going into Europe, and it's just a really cool look at the physical structure of the internet. I just thought it was a fascinating book.
Yeah, it is. I'm happy that you read it because it was, as you alluded to in the introduction, I've been a nerd for a very long time. And when I was younger, I learned, I dove into that. So, I enjoyed kind of coming back to some of that and having it revisited in such detail because he really did do a great job of diving into these things. And especially the thing that really struck me is that, we're talking about transmission protocols and fiber optics and multiplexing and all these like really heady kind of like, things that could put someone to sleep.
Right.
This book is actually really great to read. It's really, it starts, I love the way it starts off. He's like, I'm at home one day and my internet goes out.
Right.
And
I forgot about that part. Yeah.
And
like a squirrel or something.
Like a squirrel chewed through a cable. And he's sitting there looking at the cable and going, well, in my house, I plug it into the box that the cable company gives me. But there's a cable coming out the back of that goes out into the yard. Yeah. And then it goes down the street.
Yeah.
Where does it go?
Yeah. And
that sort of it provides a great setting for him to go almost on like this adventure of in the way he writes it, this adventure of going and discovering this and finding out about the very physical aspects of it, and then also finding out about the people that are actually making this happen.
Right.
In one thing they were talking about in New York, in Manhattan, how they do fiber poles that if you were to sort of make a cross section of the island, there's just all these tubes running below it, and the people that make that happen, and then also the internetworking, which is something that has come up recently because of the whole Netflix and bandwidth debates there.
So briefly, how does that work? It's what's called peering. Is that the concept where?
Yeah. So not being a certified hardware network expert, right?
Yes.
The people who out there who are, please do not burn me at the stake for this. But basically, data flows over these wires. Data flows over these tubes. We knew that this was going to. We knew that that's how it works. Sometimes you can hook two tubes up that provide a more efficient flow. Right. And the way that you hook these tubes up, it's not just like a service that you call up and go, "Hello, internet, I'd like some tubes." You know, they have large groups of people. The story he recounts is the North American Network Operators Group, NANOG. Yeah. He talks about how those deals get made, and it's just totally, human-based networking. It's very much a human issue more than a technical issue.
So he gets to the super physicality of the. So is what's roughly happening is rather than sending something out over the internet and getting it back, two companies will agree just to share data directly with each other. Is that roughly how peering is working? Or
that's a good
okay. But the way that happens is the guy at Netflix and the woman at Google get together and kind of bargain and barter, and you both have to be big enough for it to make sense, and then they make a deal, and then the pairing happens. Is that essentially what goes on? Or?
Yeah, then so the internet, the physical internet, by and large, is located in maybe a few. I'm going to say 100 buildings, maybe low thousands around the world. And some of these, each of these data centers, each of these hosting facilities has their own purpose. But some of them, if actually down just a couple miles away, Facebook has a hosting center, a data center. And if you have Facebook and Facebook and you have, Comcast or whatever, they can just plug directly from the Facebook server into the Comcast server so that data can go directly there, because otherwise something that won't make a lick of sense to anyone who's never dealt with networking concepts before, doesn't know what like a trace route is. Your data, Kent, sitting here in San Francisco, if you try and send something to, maybe a Skype video chat to someone who is, we're in Soma, you want to Skype to someone in financial district, that data might go through Oregon. Yeah. That data might go through Oregon, Seattle, and then back to LA, and then back here. The routes are absolutely ridiculous. Yeah. So this whole networking thing comes down to basically getting a better route that you can directly connect.
Yeah. And there are places where lots of these come together, right? Is that what they call the May, which is for what? The internet exchanges, May East and May West, like those big...
Oh, yeah, these big mysterious places that you only see photographs of. That they're the most amazing thing. Seriously, I know you have driven by this particular data center that I'm talking about. It's right off the 101. You can see it from the 101. Right. It's a building you physically have line of sight to. I guarantee you've never seen this building because it is the most boring, underrated building. Yeah. It's no windows. It's just a big box with some satellites on top.
Well, and that's what this guy says. He as he rolls into the different towns and travels all over the world, he really learns to recognize these things because they're super nondescript. There's no windows. Sometimes there's a guard at this super nondescript building.
Yeah, it's the art of making something. It's the art of invisibility almost. Yeah. They want these things to blend in. They don't want attention. It's not.
Well, he said that even Google's data centers at one point were or still are removed from Google Earth. Like they're not on the Google Earth.
Oh my God, that's so creepy.
That was in there somewhere. Yeah, so they took it out, or they blurred it, or I don't know exactly what that story is, but people can look it up. But he also said that Google paid this enormous amount of money for a building in Manhattan. Even for a building in Manhattan, it was a crazy amount of money, and nobody could really figure it out. Well, it turns out that the reason is that the wires that run under that building, it was like the biggest concentration of the tubes, if you will. Crossing, and so Google owns this, so they're very aware of the sort of physical. I guess it would make sense. Them and Facebook are super aware of the physical infrastructure of the thing.
Yeah, and it is. If you ever have the opportunity, the listeners here are probably generally tech focused. If anyone out there ever has the opportunity to go on a tour of a data center, if it all sounds interesting, if it doesn't sound interesting, do not do this. But it's a really interesting experience. The amount of security that you have to go through to get in, they are very serious about this.
The funny thing about, I guess you're protecting your servers, because the funny thing about that is at some point, the tube, the fiber optic cable, leaves the data center and just ends up buried in the dirt.
Well, I mean, the NSA has taught us all about that. I mean, they have a submarine that goes down, and they just kind of splice into the tube, and that's how they.
That is what happens, right?
They get everything. Yeah.
So they're not in the Google. Well, we don't know. Maybe they're in the Google data center too, but they're just tapping the tubes that move among the data centers.
Yeah, but I mean, have you seen House of Cards?
I haven't, but. Okay. Maybe many of our listeners have it, so you can explain explain along the way.
So I have a friend who's horrible about spoilers. Like he opens with the spoiler. So I'm very.
I have a Game of Thrones friend who's like, I was like, is so-and-so dead yet? Oh, they're not dead yet. Okay, never mind.
Seriously, and like no matter how many times you point out to them, they keep doing it. So I don't want to do that. But so there is a scene in where a character goes into a data center and some plot things take place. Right. But that kind of goes to underscore that sort of idea that if you physically get into one of these the experience of going into the building, it's very secure. They are very serious about it. And then once you get in, there's, depending on the facility, eye print scanners, handprint scanners. Sure. Once you get into a floor, it's the computers are all in cages, not to keep the computer in, but to keep you out. Right. It's a really interesting experience of like, this is actually what makes the internet work.
Well, it's funny. A lot of that too is probably, I assume it's theater for the executives who are buying the servers, because there's really not a huge, like, okay, let's say I'm a bad person. Like, why would I really want to break into a data center? I mean, there's nothing there. I mean, there is, but it's a bunch of encrypted.
It's not like someone's going to steal the computer and then go, oh, sweet, now I've got all this hard disk space.
You could cause mayhem, I guess.
You could definitely break things.
Yeah.
But actually, you just mentioned the theater aspect of it. One of the things that I thought was incredibly cool about this Tubes book that he mentioned, again, one of the things that fascinates me constantly is the human experience of very technical things and the sort of borders between those. But Equinix,
which was founded by Jay Adelson, who was an advisor to Nuzzle, among other things. So anyway,
I really like his recounting of that, because he talks about this sort of the drama of these rooms. Like, now, I've been in some of these, and they're really just you're basically walking through an enormous refrigerator that has computers running it. They keep these things cold, and there's fire suppression systems and all this sort of stuff. But what they do, they have like this really dramatic like lighting, and like you walk in, and it's a very like theatrical experience for the for the as they woo new customers. People are like, oh man, this really does look like the future, as opposed to just some big cold room with some computers and cables wandering around.
Well, which is what a lot of like Rackspace, for example, it was real estate guys, and they had big buildings in Texas, and the thing that they could get the most dollar per square foot for was by turning them into big refrigerators and hiring it's real estate at the end of the day. And you go, wow, that's crazy, like the internet's cool and nuts, and a couple guys in Texas, like, this is a good way to make money on real estate. And
I love how industries evolve when it comes to things like that it's sometimes it's a very pragmatic thing that ends up resulting in all these sort of downstream consequences.
So it's interesting. You get the two layers. You get the physicality of the internet, and then the concept that it's just people. Like, it's just people making deals, and the reason that maybe Comcast and Facebook talk to each other is because two people went to Nanog and had a bourbon together and agreed.
Seriously.
And are probably more nerdy and loyal to their fascination with the technology, maybe, than to Comcast or Facebook or whatever it is. And they go back and say, hey, we need to do this deal. And then cables get pulled and moved. And it's just an incredible thing.
Yeah, that almost, some of those things come out of, that reminds me of a story that I heard at a conference. This was, it was sort of Fortune 500 kind of things, and someone was up on stage talking about this experience they had where they were trying to move an application over to some new hardware or whatever, and this company ordered well over $1 million. They didn't name the number, but it was at least $1 million. It was a huge amount of hardware that was literally just simply the wrong stuff, because the person who was running the project and the person who ordered hardware did not like each other, so they just didn't really talk very much. And how that came about. But these networking agreements, it does seem like it's a very it all in the end comes back to people. We are not here, and please, robot overlords, do not come after me when we invent intelligence. It's not about the machines; it's about the people, and that's something that really, really stuck with me, especially about that Tubes book and all the things that go on out
especially these
here.
massive things that are happening. The relationship between two companies, huge companies, really comes down to a couple of people.
I mean, look at, when you look back in the 90s when Microsoft made an investment in Apple, that a lot of people looked at very curiously, and they're like, this seems like, on the surface, this seems like you're supporting your competition.
Right.
And, as things have played out, has certainly been interesting. But, the reason that happened was because of personal relationships.
Yeah. Well, I guess a lot of industries are probably like this. I guess the big oil company execs are all friends with each other, but man, certainly in Silicon Valley, you have a big competitor, but you've like, you spend time with your competitor. Like, our CEO, I'm sure there's other news applications that do what Nuzzle does, but I'm sure he goes to cocktail parties with them and has dinner with them. And, we're still all doing technology.
it reminds me of like watching a boxing match when the two people come out and sometimes they are respectful to one another, they bump gloves, sometimes they don't, like they're really angry at each other. And I've always loved that sort of the contradiction there, that people will come out and bump gloves and show sign of respect and then proceed to beat each other up.
Exactly.
So I like that idea of being able to compete, but still be, but not make it sort of like a personal, like emotional thing.
Right.
And especially out here, I think more so than in other industries, today's competition is tomorrow's merger, is tomorrow's acquisition.
Well, that's right. And you want to have competitors, because generally, if you don't have competitors, you're doing something that nobody cares about, right? Like.
That's not maybe like a hard and fast rule, but there's definitely something to that. If nobody is trying to, if nobody else is going after that a market, maybe it does beg that question.
Yeah. So I call it relatively recently arrived here. So when did it start for you? You started. I did the math. That was about 12 years old. You started coding.
Commodore 64.
Commodore 64. So how did that work? What's the Commodore 64? Like how does that come into your life? Like how do you
Commodore 64 is a very ugly old beige box that you jam a floppy into, and you have to type cryptic load star.star (8,1) enter. Was
wow, excellent.
Is still burned into my brain.
How does that happen as a kid? That you see read it in a magazine, or your dad was like an engineer or something, or what's the?
Yeah, so my dad was an accountant basically. And actually, something that this is interesting timing. One of the early memories that I have is my dad showing me this spreadsheet that he was working on, and like he was just doing some stuff with the formulas, but he made my name appear in all the things. And when you're 2 years old and your name goes blinking across the screen, you're like, "Whoa, that's the coolest thing ever!" And I was reading a bit about this history of the spreadsheet, and it struck me as that
the VisiCalc was the first. Right?
That my dad was basically using one of these new tools. To productivity reasons, right?
A lot of people credit that with the invention of the spreadsheet with the merger wave in the 1980s, which was before that. It was incredibly difficult to it just took a lot of time on paper to model out what two companies would look like put together and what the different scenarios would be. And you need to know the different scenarios for pricing the debt yield. And so basically, as when VisiCalc, this particular theory goes, VisiCalc came out. Suddenly banks could very quickly make these analyses and figure out the right yields for the debt, and that led to the was part of what contributed to the LBO and merger boom of the 1980s.
No kidding. That's so fascinating how sort of like solutions appear when the problem it appears. Like that's when people start paying attention to it. You
had a bunch of bankers
really cool.
trying to do something forever. They had very specifically were trying to figure out what the cash flows of two combined companies could look like under different scenarios so they could price the debt and the risk. And when the spreadsheet came along, they're like, yep, we know exactly what to do with that. That replaces this. And it's a competitive advantage, and we can more quickly make the assessment and make the buy and RJ Reynolds and all that stuff and get rich. So anyway, that's
nice. Well, that's sort of. I remember thinking that was cool, and then at school we in what I suspect is one of the most amazing subliminal ad campaigns ever that Apple never gets credit for. At least in South Florida, where I lived in Miami and Fort Lauderdale. The schools had Apple computers, and I always wonder how much my generation's affinity for Apple is due to the fact that we had that logo in front of us day after day after day.
Could be.
But anyways, I was around computers a lot.
You didn't have the Commodore 64 logo in front of you all the time? Or?
Oh man, if someone released a retro Commodore 64 right now,
I think Jonathan still has one.
I
somewhere, I don't know if it works.
I love my parents. They made me get rid of the Commodore years later, and oh man, I wish I had that just to remember it. But anyway, I eventually found coding to be an interesting thing. Lego logo, like being able to do all those things, and it just sort of progressed, and that's what one of the things that helped make me the nerd that I am today.
Sure. And then, how do you find your way to Silicon Valley? 16 years later? Like, why not just keep it going in Florida? I mean, this is always a topic that comes up, which is Silicon Valley really that exceptional? Like, there's New York, and there's Charlotte, North Carolina, and there's Singapore. Like, what did you like? What was your experience of coming here to Silicon Valley? You said about 4 years ago, something like that.
Yeah, a little over 4 years. Yeah, it's so my company CloudSpace. A couple of years ago, there was an acquisition by Yahoo of a product that CloudSpace was very involved with called My Blog Log.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the team came out here as a result, and as a result of all the things that came out of that, at some point the opportunity came up for me to come out here, and in sort of and sort of take on the role that I have today, which is something like sales, biz dev, strategy,
evangelist.
Maybe evangelist. Just hey Tim, you know a whole bunch about all these engineering things. Go see what people want to talk about and be helpful.
So you touch a lot of people in Silicon Valley, but from a perspective not too long ago of being from Florida. I mean, not even New York, which has its own alleged tech scene. But what do you see? Like, what's it?
So I came from Orlando, which is, most recently from Orlando. I grew up in Miami. I grew up in Fort Lauderdale, and then I went to school in Orlando. And the University of Central Florida is a really big engineering school. It was put together back in the about late '60s.
So the NASA
as
kind
Florida
of era.
Tech, for NASA, for all the aerospace, the supporting industry, the defense, and the simulation industries are huge, absolutely mind-blowingly big there. And so, when you're sending rockets all around the universe, you need really good engineers. So there is a in the sense of like the Research Triangle in North Carolina. Central Florida has that sort of underrated profile where there's a lot of very smart and very capable people that. Don't have that level of celebrity from an engineering perspective in the same way that a lot of people view Silicon Valley as that engineering perspective. Which also works well for business today.
Right.
The thing about San Francisco, the thing about the Bay Area is that you have that whole, you have that bigger spectrum of people that it's not just engineers, it's also the product folks. It's also the marketing and sales and business and all of those non-engineering roles. I very clearly remember one of the first things that really struck me as the difference, because like I said, Central Florida has a good scene. There's a lot of people doing things there. You can be very involved and you can have that experience. And I was involved there.
Yeah.
When I came out here, the thing that I found is that because there's so much, the whole spectrum of technology business exists here. I remember one day thinking to myself, there aren't problems out here in the same way that problems exist outside of this critical mass.
How so?
In the sense, and that sounds like possibly a crazy thing. So let me explain that.
That does sound crazy. I feel like I've had problems out here. Tell me more.
The thing that struck me is that if you have a problem out here with, user acquisition or finding product market fit, you can usually find someone who's actually had that same problem themselves. And you can get that advice and you can get support and you can get mentoring and feedback and things like that. And not just in a theoretical sense, like you can go get a beer with that person, you can go get a coffee with that person. And so, for the naturally curious, for the people that or have these needs that specifically like, hey, I've got this problem and I want to find, I want to get through this. Yeah. There's that support network that exists. So problems are, I think, different in that you can get direct advice. Now, which of course leads to its own set of problems sometimes in that you get too much feedback.
Yeah.
But that was something that really struck me, is that if you have a question, you can usually find someone who will help you with it.
It's interesting. There's kind of the echo chamber concept, which is you spend so much time kind of being about Silicon Valley that you don't focus. And there's a company that started in Australia that became huge. I forget what it's called exactly, but it's an accounting software thing that's worth like $1 billion. That got started in Australia, and it wasn't even in Sydney. It was just somewhere, nowhere. It's now $1 billion company. They kind of said, we were able to focus because we weren't in Silicon Valley.
Yep.
That said, Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, Instagram, I mean, they're all from here.
Yeah.
They're not from Charlotte. There might be great things in New York, maybe Foursquare, but not SAP, not PeopleSoft, not Salesforce, not,
Yeah,
Uber,
and especially the
Lyft.
B2B side of things, the businesses are here, so it makes it easy for that to happen. But on the two sides to every coin.
Sure.
Warren Buffett is one of the most successul investors alive.
Yeah.
He's someone I have a lot of respect for him and Charlie Munger, what they've done, which is obvious because of how successful they are. But I try to pay attention to them and listen to that sort of stuff. And they're in Omaha.
Yeah.
And Buffett deliberately, he, as he tells the story, says that he wanted to be in Omaha, so he's not around New York, and he's not around that sort of groupthink.
Yeah. But he's an example of that working as a big success, where there aren't as many examples of tech companies that have done that. Qualcomm in San Diego is one, for example.
Yeah.
I think eventually what has to happen, this is my theory. Well, there's also, to wrap up on the thesis list here, there's also the thesis that, as a friend of mine puts it, James Currier, that this is the capital city. That it's like if you're in the Roman Empire and you want to do something, you go to Rome, right? You don't stay in Dublin or Lyon or whatever at the time. You go to freaking Rome and fight the battle with the big boys, right?
Yeah,
so Larry and Sergey aren't from here, but they came here and founded Google. And the guys who want to play, Mark Zuckerberg didn't stay in Boston with its tech community and venture capitalists. He got a house in Palo Alto. So there's the selection bias too, where if you want to play the game, you come to Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I mean, there's also if you're motivated, having moved away from the place that I grew up.
Yeah.
On some level, I did that once when I went to college, but on a much bigger scale, moving out here. And I hope this isn't sort of like a sort of backwards compliment to myself or something like that. But if you are going to invest that heavily to move yourself away from something and give up, I think in some ways friendships and relationships and all those things, or maybe change them.
Yeah.
You're going to work really hard.
Yeah.
At that, so that coming here sort of, I think, elevates in your own mind a little bit the stakes.
Well, so I'll give you a crazy thesis from the craziest of all, from Ben Stein, the writer. Mm-hmm. And he was, Bueller and Ferris Bueller, Bueller guy. He talks about how if you look at history, and this may be ridiculous, but whatever, that the people who left England were the people who left. They were not content staying in England. They came to the East Coast of the United States. Some people stayed on the East Coast of the United States. Some people went west. And that as you look at the people who are in England, the people who are in Boston are the people who weren't satisfied staying in England. You look at the people in Chicago, the people who weren't satisfied further west. When you got to the West Coast, you ran out of places to go because there was water. Mm-hmm. And then people went up into their mines. And that's Hollywood in Southern California and the technology industry in Northern California. So that's his.
I'd never heard Ben Stein. Well, no,
it was
actually,
one of his books.
That's really interesting
Buy the
to me.
book, yeah.
This is not the first time I've heard that idea. I've never heard Ben Stein's name associated with that. The person who originally told me that is a good friend of mine. I've known him for years. Incredibly smart individual. I mean, just absolutely. And he put that in sort of a genetics context that there are our imperfect understanding of genetics. Yeah. There are markers for risk taking. There are markers for all of these attributes, the way they get expressed. Yeah. And genetically, there's an argument that the people who came over here then produced a more risk taking group who came from England, and then the people who progressed westward increasingly created, the Oregon Trail sucked. Going across this country, that sucked back in the day.
Well, and that's the why there's so many good-looking people in Los Angeles, is that over the years, if you were in Omaha or wherever and you were good-looking enough that you thought maybe you could be a model or somebody, you'd come to Los Angeles. It wouldn't work out. You'd become an accountant, but you were still good looking and you had the kids. So.
Are we breeding a new strain of human of super attractive?
Yeah. I wouldn't go that far, but there is something to if people do something in a biased way, go to LA when they're attractive, move further west to take risks. There's something to it, and of course there's outliers. I'm sure there's risk takers still in London, and there's unattractive people in LA too.
No, yeah, that's that's an interesting thing that I find when people talk about groups is that there's almost like a subconscious assumption that these are somehow rules, and it's genetics and destiny and things like that. It's tendencies. You're stacking decks.
I wish everyone would just take statistics and just understand the difference between like this is a fact and this is a tendency and this is a probability. Like if you could just use actual statistics and standard deviations, it would make so many things easier.
Absolutely. But then you could be a data scientist.
Yeah, exactly.
And make all of the money.
Yeah. Or most of the money. So you have to be precise with your terms. I do think eventually what can't happen is everyone can't come to Silicon Valley. There's just not. We can't have 120 million programmers living in Silicon Valley.
It would be a horrible idea for all of the reasons.
Yeah, and the prices for engineering talent, the prices for housing. We'll get to a point, I think, where eventually it has to be the case that part of your engineering team will be in Ohio or Florida or all over the planet.
Dublin, Ireland is a main growth area.
I think it has to happen as just simply a secular trend that everyone can't be here, like just physically. There is a limit to it. That's
what's the old saying? Anything that cannot go on forever will stop.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's like not to be like Malthusian about it, but like you can't all come to the mission, basically.
Yeah, no, and
you can try, but everyone's trying for sure.
Yeah, and there's everything is a double-edged sword, right? There's always more than one way of looking at things, and in a way, there are opportunities for just take one of the I think the obvious ones in ways that in which being outside the valley, being outside San Francisco and the Silicon Valley area, is an advantage. If you were, say, a motivated individual who has saved up, accumulated a certain amount of money, and you want to work on something that requires a great deal of your own personal time and thought, you can buy more time and thought by having a place in an area of the country that is very cheap to live. You can take the same budget and double or maybe triple your effective lifespan by not being here and flying back and forth. The rents out here are so crazy that you really could make an economic argument that living at a city with a cheap flights to San Francisco would actually be cheaper than living here, and you could be very effective.
And I think some people are getting there already. So. In any case, we should probably start wrapping up, but I want to hear about the book.
Oh, God,
you're working on a book, for God's sake.
I am.
What brought you to writing a book? It sounds hard.
It is, surprisingly. It's so the subject that I'm writing about is technical debt. And
now, is there any chance you're going to make that interesting? That sounds brutal.
Probably.
Having just talked about a book called Tubes that we thought was fascinating.
Yeah, I know, right? It's no pressure, right? It's just to recap it really quickly. There's this being able to maintain software and being able to work on it and add features and sort of like keep things going is essential, not just to engineers but also to businesses. There's a couple famous stories where like the reason we have Internet Explorer is because when Netscape, for those of you who may remember, Netscape 4.7 was a wildly popular browser. They ended up with so much technical debt, which basically made it hard to do some work on the code and add features that they had to do a big rewrite, and Internet Explorer came in and stole Netscape's lunch, and the history of the web has been different ever since in a lot of ways.
Interesting, yeah.
So the thing that fascinates me
what
is
that technical debt?
Yeah, it's not just an engineering concern, it's a business concern. Technical debt, this is actually, there's a lot of ways of characterizing it. The thing that I am landing on as a good description is that it's the stuff that makes it hard for engineers to change a piece of code to make it do what they want to do. It comes in a lot of different forms, and it would be very difficult to recap here, which is why I'm in the early stages of trying to understand the best way to characterize this, because every engineer out there in modern software development, especially SaaS kind of things, every single one of them knows what technical debt is. Non-engineers do not have the same grasp of it.
Yeah.
And through no intellectual fault of their
Well,
own.
this is the thing.
know?
One of the things, I'm not a technical person. I mean, I don't write code. We leave it at that, and not say I'm not a technical person, but I'm very respectful of engineers. I suspect the thing that the symptom of this is when you're an executive who's like, there's 20 guys working on one problem. They've been doing it for 4 months. Like, what's taking so long? Mm-hmm. Like, this doesn't, as a business guy, this doesn't make sense. I assume the answer is generally, yeah, well, either you're getting screwed or, yeah, no, there's technical debt that has to be paid before we can build your next thing.
Yeah, a little bit. If it's an existing code base,
yeah,
there's usually something to that. The term sort of came out of the what would it be 80s or 90s Ward Cunningham, who, unless you're an engineer, you've probably never heard his name, but very smart man, made the comparison that there's a concept similar to financial debt, that if you are a company and you are burdened with financial debt, you will find it very hard to get things done.
Right.
And so there's the metaphor can be dragged out and tortured in a lot of different ways.
Which I love to do. If you've listened to the podcast, I'm fine with that.
You were going to love the intro of this book, because that's one of the things that I really want to do, is make it a little bit more accessible. I hope I can make it as enjoyable to read as Tubes.
Yeah.
But I just want to make it a little bit more accessible, because I see the impact that this issue has. And, I bet I could make a reasonable argument that it's in the billions of dollars.
Wow.
And it's a subject I find interesting.
What form will the book be? A manual for non-technical people kind of thing, or code debt for dummies? Trademark, I get it, but you know what I mean. Like,
yeah, that's something that I haven't decided yet. I'm still also gathering a lot of. I'm trying to include case studies, because I feel like that's something that speaks very well, and it lets people use their own senses and their own intelligence to extract information from the situation, rather than simply taking me at my word.
Yeah.
So the form of that is a little still up in the air. I have a feeling the first third of the book is going to be much more, if you are not an engineer, read this.
Yeah.
And then after that, I'm going to go into some of the very heady engineering sort of, here's what causes the problem, here's how you can deal with this thing, and just provide not a rule book, but guidelines for how to think about it and talk about it and manage it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So when do we look forward to this book?
Oh, man. Easily next year.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to keep you in suspense for so long.
Yeah. Hopefully before then you'll come back on the podcast and we can talk more about technical debt. That'd be great.
Yeah, man. I always love talking to you. I've always said you're a very good conversation.
Well, this is a good format for you. This has been a great conversation. I feel like we've touched a lot of topics here, and I thank you so much for coming in.
Yeah, man. Thanks a lot.
All right. This has been the Something Venture podcast. Thank you so much. We will talk to you next time.